what was kind of lurking within Occupy Wall Street and that populist moment was the sort of like long tail of the Tea Party. You had like libertarians insinuating themselves in there, Ron Paul type of people, and then Russian disinformation kind of scooping up a lot of activists and putting them in this kind of international framework for their geopolitical visions. And amid all of that, you started to see this media cycle talking about young people are talking about socialism. Socialism is hip now. And I saw that, and that was the first thing that rang my alarm bells because I'm like,
Yeah.
you shouldn't see things on the media. You should see them in everyday life. And so I was like, uh-oh, this could go the other way. Like when the pendulum starts falling the other direction, this is
Yeah.
dangerous.
When was the book published?
The book was published actually, I think in January or early February 2017, but I started working on it in 2014, I
Yeah.
think.
And when it came out, let's see, I'm trying to remember what the context was, 2016. So it came out a year after Trump was elected, because you talk quite a bit about Trump in the book, but of course, that's the first time around.
Well, it came about a month after he was elected, a month or two.
Yeah.
Yeah,
First time
so
around.
exactly, exactly. Yeah, when I started writing the book, he hadn't even declared for the campaign, and I remember having friends with, I remember having burritos, with my friends, just sort of saying, do you think he'll win? Like, I don't know. Maybe he will. Maybe he's being underestimated. And I
Yeah.
was already writing my book and talking, we were talking about the alt-right and stuff, you
Yeah.
know. So he kind of came out of left field. And that's interesting because in a sense, it feels like he's the guy, he's responsible, he's to blame.
Hmm.
But at the same time, there were a lot of undercurrents that he seized on, or rather, that seized on him. And
Yeah.
so he can be seen as kind of more of an apotheosis than
Mhm.
the cardinal instigator.
Well, yeah, and he, you know, my he's sort of a con artist who uses whomever is available to do a thing with.
Totally. But I think at the same time, he has always had sort of fixed opinions about the way that the US should flaunt its power worldwide, the problems with the Republican Party and its liberalism,
Yeah.
um, and generally the post-war order.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So let me introduce you properly here. This is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and I am Frank Schaeffer, and my guest is Dr. Alexander Reid Ross, Ph.D. Alexander is an award-winning geographer whose work includes scholarly research on resource management, journalistic investigations into transnational political networks, and professional reports on disinformation and the far right. Alexander is the author of a book which I have read and we're going to be talking about, Against the Fascist Creep. Do you have that book handy? Because I read mine on Kindle. I want to hold it up and wave it around, but I don't have one.
No, I'm sorry. I gave my last one away.
That's terrible. Okay, well, picture the book. We will mention the title again, Against the Fascist Creep. And I just talked before we started this podcast with Alexander about the fact that he was working on this book well before Donald Trump's first election, mentions Trump in the book. Um, and then since then, your book has become much too much for comfort of the moment because now we're into the second Trump presidency. And, everything you talk about in the book, I wish it wasn't as relevant to the moment we're in as it is. So, to have a book that you've written before Trump came along called Against Fascist Creep is pretty prescient and prophetic. Tell me a little bit of what you were saying a moment ago before we got going here. You were working on the book and you and your friends were talking and saying, oh, Trump thinks he might run. What do you think? And trying to roll our mind back to the day when he wasn't a thing and was just kind of emerging, and then picking up on some of the themes that you talk about the book. So let's discuss the context in which you wrote the book. why were you writing a book on fascism before Trump was even president and everybody was talking about the fact that we're sliding in that direction? You know, you're a geographer, you're a scholar. There's a lot of things you could be writing about. How did you approach this project to start with? What got this going back in the day?
Well, I actually started writing this in relation to my work as a radical environmental activist back
Yeah,
in 2014. We were working on things like trying to stop megaloads from building up the Canada tar sands here in the Pacific Northwest. And I started to notice some, upsetting things about some of my fellow activists. And I started to read more about these kinds of strange currents that thrive within general populist subcultures and social
mm,
movements. And that really kind of alarmed me. And I started to write about things to avoid if you're an activist. And that was kind of my intention with writing my book. It was to say none of these are bad necessarily, like radical egoism and individualism or like ecology or
yeah,
like, even things like heathenism and like ancient mythical, I don't know, pantheism and stuff like that, all these kind of weird subcurrents that you find kind of flowing in and out of radical groups. I'm like, these aren't necessarily bad things, but they can go really, really dark places. And that
yeah.
was kind
And
of the point.
one of the things that's interesting in your book that I think differentiates it from many other things, and let me just say that Against the Fascist Creep is a terrific book. So first, it's really, really good, and I want to include it in our book club. I think we'd like to offer it in January to commemorate the inauguration of our next president that we're talking about here. But um, one thing that's interesting in the book that we I want to talk about a little bit with you is the relationship between the left and right in terms of their interchangeability. And of course, in your book, you go back to kind of the beginning of the movement we call fascism in France in the 19th century, and then of course it has historical roots before that. I mean, some of the heroes in the fascist movement are found in the Roman Empire, and both Hitler and Mussolini wanted to quote get back to strong men, and there's Nietzsche and the whole bit. There are many many
Mm.
threads here, but let's just dwell for a minute before I start quoting your own book to you and asking you questions about it because I've got a lot of notes here. Um, Talk a little bit about something you don't hear much about, which is really brought out in your book, which is what you might call the kind of weird offshoots and extremist parts of the left wing movement, the
Mhm.
eco movement, all sorts of bits and pieces of left wing activism that butt up against and almost become interchangeable with, and it sometimes actually feed into very distinctly fascist movements. And why is that? In other words, what
Mm.
is it about the characteristics of someone who's into something, quote, radical or counter-revolutionary from the left? All of a sudden, they're fellow travelers with people on the right. And then it sort of becomes one thing. And this keeps happening through history. And the elements, the fascists claim, a certain amount of socialism, these other things. These movements are not as distinct as I think some people think they are.
Well, that's a problem, I think, often with the human mind and with idealizing ideologies and trying to create some dogmatic structure is that
Yeah,
people are complicated. They're always going around and the principle applied to the reality is always messy and difficult.
mm,
We try to have integrity and to act, in accordance with our beliefs. And sometimes that leads us to, weird outcomes. And so I think that, the historic moment that we're in my opinion, began at sort of like the long 2010s in 2008 with the Tea Party and Trump emerging as a political leader.
yeah,
But then we really have to understand kind of the counter movement in 2011 with Occupy Wall Street, which was fundamentally a sort of like opposition to what you might call a plutocracy or an oligarchy, this kind of idea of like 99% against the 1% who hold
yeah,
the power and stuff like that. And it kind of targeted liberal politicians and technocracy just as much as it targeted sort of a conservative Koch brothers sort of
sure.
networks and things like that. However, what was kind of lurking within Occupy Wall Street and that populist moment was the sort of like long tail of the Tea Party. You had like libertarians insinuating themselves in there, Ron Paul type of people, and then Russian disinformation kind of scooping up a lot of activists and putting them in this kind of international framework for their geopolitical visions. And amid all of that, you started to see this media cycle talking about young people are talking about socialism. Socialism is hip now. And I saw that, and that was the first thing that rang my alarm bells because I'm like,
Yeah,
you shouldn't see things on the media. You should see them in everyday life. And so I was like, uh-oh, this could go the other way. Like when the pendulum starts falling the other direction, this is
yeah,
dangerous. And in fact, I did start to see this. There are roots of the radical right that is, fundamentally opposed to modernism and to urbanization and to ideas of social equality that emerge. And they have been this way since the French Revolution, right? I
yeah,
mean, you have
yeah.
counter-revolutionary understanding of social relations and class relations in urban settings as fundamentally deracinated, uprooted from the sort of genteel people of the rural tradition,
Yeah.
and thrown into this sort of abstract universalist position where they're dislocated from time and space and it's, original seasonal, patterns and so on and so forth. So there's this sort of patriarchal understanding of the people that contradicts the efforts of popular sovereignty in, what was at that time this sort of urban liberal environment.
Hmm.
And that counter-revolutionary tradition tended to adopt a strategy that used the strategies and tactics of revolutionary movements in order to counter them, counter revolution.
Sure. Yeah.
And you get that with Napoleon Bonaparte, as Germaine de Stael, identified in her books about the French Revolution. And so this counter-revolutionary movement, using even sometimes discourses of liberalism in order to undermine this revolutionary movement, has stuck over the ages.
Yeah.
It's gotten more effective, and it manifests in the fascist movement, which constantly uses these sorts
Well, and
of.
and constantly one thing that's so interesting about your book is sort of the plus change plus la même chose. It's always the same thing, but
Mm,
the fascist movement through history, starting in the beginnings in France, that you take us through all the way into the present and through Mussolini, Spain, Franco, Hitler, etc., up until the present. Not only borrowing from the left, but sometimes people on the left and right almost working together in tandem on something, using each other's methods, street fighters, in Germany before Hitler comes to power, with very similar goals in terms of overthrowing what they both regard as a decadent kind of bourgeois regime. They're going to impose their own truth, very much nationalistic in their own ways. I just found it so interesting. Let me just say, take a minute here and let people know the sweep of the content of your book by actually reading your table of contents. Chapter 1, the original Fascist Creep. Chapter 2, spirit and subculture. Chapter 3, a brief history of fascist intrigue. Chapter 4, the radical right. Chapter 5, the third position. We'll get into all of this. Chapter 6, National Bolsheviks. Chapter 7, Fascists of the Third Millennium. Chapter 8, Autonomous Nationalism and Fascist Geopolitics. Chapter 9, From the Tea Party to Occupy Wall Street, something you touched on briefly a moment ago. Chapter 10, The New Synthesis. And then conclusion, Swords into Plowshares. So, the sweep of your book, I picked a piece here, where's it from, early in your introduction, that I'm going to read here. The fascist creep, in quotes, as I am using the term in this text, refers to porous borders between fascism and the radical right, through which fascism is able to, quote, creep into mainstream discourse. However, the fascist creep is also a double-edged term because it refers more specifically to the crossover space between right and left, that engenders fascism in the first place. And we need to get into that. Okay, back to your
Mhm.
introduction. Hence, fascism creeps in two ways. One, it draws left wing notions of solidarity and liberation into ultra nationalist right wing ideology.
Mhm.
Two, at least in its early stages, fascists often utilize, quote, broad front strategies proposing a mass based nationalist platform to gain access to mainstream political audiences and key administrative positions. And then, once in a while, one of their leaders, even if it's a flaky con artist who is neither a fascist nor a communist nor left wing or right wing, he's just all about himself, wins an election, but then gets used by people who have a real program that kind of fits into yours. So,
Mm.
we're talking about this book. It's very important. We're going to offer it as a book club item in January. And I would note in passing before we get into the conversation any deeper, please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack. It has to be said commentary at frankschaeffer.substack.com. And this book will be against the fascist creep. Will be our It Has to Be Read book club offering in January. So let's go back to that setup that I just read. And let me pull again a line out from that I think is so important. It draws left wing notions of solidarity into liberation and ultra nationalist right wing ideology. So let's go back to what we were talking about a minute ago,
Mm.
this
Mhm.
kind of cross fertilization and cross pollination, whether it's Occupy Wall Street or Black Lives Matter or whatever it may be, that we tend to think of as left wing protests and so forth and so on, but
Mm. Mhm.
oddly mirroring and or becoming at some point something that really actually pushes along a kind of a rising fascism.
Mm.
And one area you talk about, and then I'm going to shut up here and let you talk about your book. But I found the whole section fascinating, and I've got a quote to read you
Mhm.
later on the sort of mansphere movement. Let's be real men, the incels and all this business also as part of this. So there are so many threads weaving together here. Um, and I'd like you to kind of explain that, those threads weaving together and how they relate to each other.
Mm.
Pick up any point of departure you want, and then let's get into it.
Oh, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, so one thing that's kind of stuck in my mind recently is this idea of the opposition between left and right as one between freedom and equality, where the right believes in total freedom for the individual and believes that equality holds that back, and the
Mm,
left believes in equality and, in the more radical instance, believes that equality should repress freedom, right? I think there's something to that in the sense of Noberto Bobbio's definition of the left wing as being fundamentally in favor of equality. That's fine. In favor of equality is good. And if we look back in United States history and look at people like the old Republican John Randolph saying, "I'm an aristocrat, I love freedom, and I hate equality," right?
yeah,
These are, John Randolph of Roanoke. So these are like pretty baked in understandings and distinctions that we've set up for ourselves. And I think sometimes they get a little bit messy. Like when we're talking about, for example, the sort of defining characteristic of fascism, we're looking straight at ultranationalism, right?
hmm,
This tendency to mythologize a past that's archetypal and mythological, and to try and sort of reconstitute it in the present through some sort of magical rebirth process
yeah,
where chauvinism can once again reign, and the man can dominate the family and the earth and so on. Now, there are, interesting ways that that can go. In one sense, nationalism can be very collectivist, right?
yeah,
So you can end up with what Mussolini had, which was a nationalist, syndicalist kind of political tendency,
mm,
where people like Arturo Labriola could sort of operationalize something like a union movement where the workers would run all the factories, but they would all do it in the context of a national hierarchy with a sort of almost feudal leadership
Yeah.
class in place. Um, of course, they didn't do that. As soon as they obtained power, they banned strikes and gained absolute control over the workers and rolled back all labor protections. Um, Similar with the Nazis, they promised that they would have this sort of like a nationalist union. And then the second they took power, they dismantled the actual union, sent their leadership to concentration camps, and then rolled back the social wage.
Yeah.
And I can get into the economics of that, but primarily the importance here is understanding that they are trying to take advantage of the Workers' Party, as Tucker
Yeah.
Carlson described it, in order to fasten the working class and working class sentiments to this sort of upstart um, revolutionary nationalist, or counter-revolutionary is the right word,
Well, and you bring that up. I
nationalist
mean,
movement.
the Republicans are kind of playing that card now, saying, okay, the Democrats, used to talk about unions, this sort of thing. We are now the party of workers,
Hmm. Oh yeah.
and we represent the worker, and the Republicans, represent the man in the street and the worker, and the Democrats are all about university-based and media-based elites, and we actually represent you, the worker. So
Mhm.
what you're describing in the history of, say, National Socialism in Germany is literally unfolding here again in a slightly different context. But that kind of claim of representing the workers, while you have tech bros like Elon Musk who ban unions in his own shops, are part of this. So I just throw that in there. Keep going.
Oh yeah, 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 absolutely. And to carry on down that thread, I mean, if you look at the problem of tariffs, the left has in the past supported some degree of tariffs.
Sure.
In the United States, the famous American system of Henry Clay called for tariffs, and they would sustain internal improvements like
Hmm.
roads and so on and so forth. But what Trump is calling for is tariffs plus austerity. So
Yeah.
it's not like the old American system, which is sort of a mutual advancement kind of idea. And you look at John Quincy Adams and his sort of interest in the
Yeah.
old cooperativist movement of Robert Owen, and then also Andrew Jackson's worky, so-called worky support.
Yeah.
There's a lot of kind of fascinating ways that working radical working class movements have fit into the history of the presidency in the United States.
Mm.
For our purposes now, like if you look at the tariff austerity combination, this is something that was pretty significant in the fascist period. If we
Yeah.
look if we look at Italy in the 1920s and its policies of tariffs, and then we also look at the United States in the 1920s and some going up into the 1950s even, and some of the sort of fascist sympathizing
Yeah.
politicians of the Republican Party who advocated similar tariff policies. So Trump
Mm.
is really following through in this kind of interesting vein that was opened up before the fascists, but was certainly in their minds a sort of vanguard strategy. Now, they also had other theorists who were more in favor of free trade, and economic elitism, like Pareto. But really, like when you look at Mussolini's policies, he especially once you get into the 1930s and the war in Africa, he needed those tariffs. They did cause inflation. He tried to
Sure.
force the prices down, which
Yeah.
bankrupted a lot of the retailers, and it brought about the cartelization of industry. And so
Hmm.
this really served the heavy industrialists and kind of screwed the light industry.
Yeah.
There's a whole book about this. Who's it? It's not Gentile. Daniel Guérin,
Yeah.
about fascism and big business. But
Very, very much on the oligarch model that we're beginning to get to here with the people Trump is involved with in this second presidency.
Oh yeah, 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 absolutely. So that's the kind of the catch, right? Is that the marketing is all about the working class
Yeah,
and the people. And I think I should like stress the people and the populism of it because a lot of people will say that fascism was not a populist movement because it was so elitist. And there
yeah,
is some truth to that. But there's also an interesting kind of fact there that Mussolini was an increasingly became populist. The
yeah, sure.
longer he was in power, the more he was appealing to the people, marching arm in arm with the party, and so on and so forth. He would criticize demagogues and all that kind of stuff, but then once he was in power, he became one.
Very soon became one. Yeah,
And it was the
speaking of which,
assassination attempts which really
yeah.
kind of enabled him to enact some of his most
Well, not
ruthless
not to mention the fact
consolidation.
that a lot of these leaders all share a kind of egomaniacal meism that is only fed by something. So on top of strategy, they are also just sucking up some of the adulation and population, of the population and do things to get that. You say in the near the open of your book, the popularity of Donald Trump, the Donald Trump campaign, mainstream white nationalist organizing, and web hubs, which saw internet traffic increase to record levels. And by the way, you're talking about the first Trump run here, and it's all too apropos of the second. This occurred because Trump's platform derived from white nationalist talking points such as the elimination of the 14th Amendment and the expulsion of 11 million immigrants. Well, now that number's up to 20. While
Mm.
Trump himself spread white nationalist images and memes, what was exposed by Trump's campaign then was the increasing tolerance for white nationalist ideas among the mainstream, as well as the increasing radicalization of politics in the United States and the influence of fascism. Now, just
Mm.
tell us again, when did you write those lines? Give us a year because it sounds like yesterday, but when did you
What,
write that?
what chapter was that in?
It's in the early stages of your book, maybe the introduction or the first chapter, I forget.
Yeah, it would have been 2016. It would have been early 2016, I think, because um, by mid 2016 we were already in edits and fact checking and all of that kind
Yeah,
of stuff. But I was writing stuff like that in late 2015. I wrote a whole series of articles about Trumpism.
yeah,
And basically outlined all this stuff about Roger Stone
yeah, everybody.
and Roy Cohen and
When you
just
talk about old friends of mine like Pat Buchanan, who I knew personally, and we used to talk all the time when I was in the religious right and strategize on how we could help each other and so forth. Let me just reintroduce you a second here. Alexander Reid, um, Alexander Reid Ross. I keep not doing the last bit.
Mm.
Has written this book that we want to talk about here today, um, against the fascist creep. And I want to jump into something in this book and get to it early so we have time to delve in a little bit. There's so many things that are interesting in this book. We're going to make it our January offering in our book club. And, I would just say this, if you want to understand the moment we're in, this is the book. It's very, very important. And it's not just a diatribe about Trump. In fact, Trump figures as a kind of a minor figure here, really, because it's about actually the rise of fascism starting really in the 19th century as we know it now until the present. One place, let's see, where is this in the book? I'm going to just tell you what part of the book it's in that, so people get an idea of. Yeah, this is like in page 260 or something like that. But let me just jump in and show you the wide range of the book and how pertinent it is to our moment. I'm reading from the book. At the forefront of the new synthesis of fascist theory and style is a white nationalist named Richard Spencer. As a young man, Spencer supported Pat Buchanan and Ross Perot, both of whom, by the way, I knew personally. Before turning toward the left in graduate school and studying the Frankfurt School, when his winding ideological path took him back to the right, it was tinged with the left's criticism of conventional conservatives. And again, I love the way you weave these two together. The left and right are not all that separate when it comes to what I'll call the kind of activist fringe sometimes. After abandoning his PhD studies for, quote, a life of thought crime, as Spencer found himself editing Buchanan's American Conservative, but left after his racist treatment of a rape scandal at Duke University. He then joined the white nationalist Tack Eyes magazine, founded by American conservative co-founder Panagiotis Taki Theodorakopoulos. His reputation grew as a popular speaker at the H.L. Mencken Club of paleoconservatives and Rothbardians. You'll have to read the book to know what all that is. Spencer launched AlternativeRight.com as a kind of a switchboard to connect the radical right positions of paleoconservatism and libertarianism to white nationalism. With the financial help of paleoconservatives at the more mainstream VDARE.com, the alt-right movement has come to define the shape and shape the linkages between traditionalism, neo-reaction, pan-successionism, race realism, esoteric fascism, and the mainstream radical right. And there's a lot more. But what I wanted to do is jump into this, not just the cross-fertilization here, but one of the strengths of your book is you do the personal histories of some of these remarkable, flamboyant characters, but you show, better than any book I've ever read, the relationship between what we'll call the new media. Fast forward to Musk buying TikTok and turning it into X and making it a part of the money losing, but nevertheless Republican machinery.
Yeah.
Um, your book details sort of the precursor to that and really
Mm.
how the groundwork was laid for, online life and, our phones, as it were, becoming the conduit of everything from the incels and the abuse of women to all sorts of other things. But let's talk for a minute simply about the correlation between the rise of fascism in America, this weird assortment of characters, and you can talk about some of them. One of the things that ties them all together is this kind of disdain of women.
Yeah.
And you find this everywhere in the movement right now. You find it in Trump's cabinet. Apparently, you have to either be accused of rape or some sort of sexual violation to even be considered. I'm only being slightly facetious. Talk a little bit about the rise of fascism, the treatment of women, the view of women, and how you tie this all in your book and some of the personal histories of these people you follow that are simply abominable, but at the same time start having a sameness to them. It's like, oh, haven't I? Oh no, this is this guy, but it was very similar to this other guy. They all seem to be on this same treadmill. What is it about hating women, the rise of fascism, and our kind of plutocratic characters that are come forth in the new Trump administration? I mean, what's the deal here? Because it's like everything in your book is something that could be ripped from the headlines right now. These are all the same kind of people, and in some cases, literally the same people.
Yeah, I think misogyny is a pretty good litmus test for, the quality of somebody's character. And this is why, I'm gonna just, slightly disagree that I think, left wing and right wing are very, very different. But at the same time, sometimes you get people who make this kind of big crossover, and there are threads that they can travel to explain that crossover.
Yeah,
But that is on the level of ideology, and it's often just making excuses for people who suck.
yeah,
And those people, are generally speaking, are misogynists,
yeah,
and racists and nationalists. But a lot of times, these are excuses that misogynists use to justify being awful people.
yeah,
Mussolini was a leftist, right? He was a radical leftist.
yeah,
Um, he claimed that he was sort of a worker before he became a left-wing organizer, but in fact, he was not like one of the calloused hands or what have you.
mm,
He, though, had a history of abusing women,
yeah,
right? Before he turned into an ultranationalist. And, it looks like he probably got a little bit of money from various sources, industrialists, for example, to try and motivate Italy to join World War One, and that was the source of his break with the Socialist Party. So money has a lot to do with it as well, right?
yeah,
Incentivizing people away from the thankless, tasks of this sort of adventuristic and romantic
hmm,
revolutionary life. And to maybe like transfer some of that romance and adventure into the cause of a nationalist awakening or what have you, right? So money, power, women, it's Scarface.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that the real sort of despicable patriarchal approach to women is at the source of reactionary politics. And what I mean by that, I already talked about this sort of like parochial kind of like rural agrarian idealism. And that's sort of just scratching the surface of where men who advance this idea of universal freedom just for themselves and for no
Yeah.
one else.
Yeah. Elon
And
Musk.
yeah, exactly. Well, yes. There is Elon Musk, Elon has been one of these people who advances the notion of, the pater familias, right? The male is responsible for the household, and that with, the left and the woke mind virus, it's all there to break up the family and all of that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
Well, he's been through a few families, right? He
Yes.
has a number of kids by different partners, and I don't think he's stopping, right? So
Right.
this is an issue of hypocrisy there. And I think you see more than hypocrisy in terms of Trump's associates,
Yeah.
the various scandals that RFK Jr. has been implicated in regarding, for example, his babysitter and various members of the media. And then you also have,
Well, not to mention levels of infidelity that drove one of his wives to suicide.
right, well, it's all like that just down the line, right?
Yeah, but the funny thing is, and I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I literally, this is not a rhetorical question. You've studied this whole thing. These guys all could be ripped from any of the pages of history when it comes to the character of some of these fascist ideologues in terms of how they treated people individually, but what's with this unanimity of accusations, many of them, from very credible people, starting with Trump, but including all these people he's appointing, and one form or another of either sexual scandal and or much worse, abuse of people and or much worse, a kind of a unanimity of, what do all these stories have in common? Oh, well, there's always a woman or women somewhere who have been mistreated, abused physically or sexually. And this just sort of seems to run through the whole gamut of these characters. And
Mhm.
it's just crazy. I mean, every
Richard Spencer.
administration has somebody like this. This administration has no one but people like this.
Well, and I mean, it's not only the administration. It's you talked about Richard Spencer. I mean, he was implicated in
Yeah,
abusing his ex-wife, right?
yeah,
Doing things like throwing her down the stairs, if I remember correctly.
yeah, exactly.
So yeah, it's a big problem, and again, this is one of those crossover issues. It's not just a right-wing thing. We
No, of
can't
course
sort
not.
of
You know,
self-satisfied, arms crossed, say, you look at those bad right-wingers. This is a guy thing, right?
yeah,
Men
it's a guy.
are terrible to women.
Yeah,
And the degree to which people are terrible to women tends to indicate the degree to which they are sort of just brutal and dishonest people. And
yeah,
that translates to a whole, lot of other political issues down the line.
yeah.
But then there is also the fact that the right wing signally advocates anti-women policies, whereas
Well,
the
and they
left
advocate a
tends not
form of,
to.
these sort of former cage fighters who wind up as podcast hosts or whatever. There's a thing that runs through this that relates directly back into the ideals of the Roman centurion and empire, where basically, the Romans always win because when they lose, they come back and slaughter you. And there's this idea of strength, which is antithetical, by the way, to the history of Christianity, which offered an alternative. I'm not saying that they didn't then sin against the alternative by hypocrisy, but nevertheless, what strikes me so much about the right today, paying lip service to their evangelical voters and yet resurrecting what is essentially a pre-Christian Roman model of worship of male strength that
Mhm.
manifests itself very clearly in the treatment of all sorts of people. But
Mm.
the weak and the least of these and the last shall be first, all that Christian
Yeah.
stuff is totally out of fashion with any of these folks,
Yes. Yeah.
increasingly including with the so-called Christians who voted them in.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there are complicated histories, right? I agree completely with your reading of the Christian faith. Um, I kind of like the whole Pauline tradition. Um,
Neither Jew nor Gentile, Greek nor, free nor slave, male nor female. I mean, that's the Pauline tradition. And except when he then reverted to being a Pharisee and living in the Roman Empire and said, "No, by the way, keep your head covered and shut up in church to women." So
okay,
that's there.
not
That's
the
there
whole
too.
Pauline tradition.
Yeah, that's part of it.
The nice stuff. But yeah, exactly. No, no, no. That's what I mean. Like, it's a complicated historical tradition, and you get the Crusades, just like you get, um, weird outbreaks of heretical revolts and interesting, I think, spiritualist tendencies like the Franciscans.
Yeah,
Um, really dynamic tendencies like the Jesuits. And of course the roots of what is basically the United States' civil religion,
yeah,
so Christianity has a whole lot, to recommend it, but it also has a very complicated history with, lots and lots of justifications for violence.
yeah,
And so when
absolutely.
you see like things like the tattoo of Deus Vult, right, you think it immediately indexes sort of Islamophobic
Yeah,
desire to conquer the Holy Land and things like that, which are deep-seated within the Christian tradition. And at the same time, you're right when you talk about the sort of the male fantasies, right?
yeah,
As Thulheit called it, this sort of like dreams of a mythical past,
yeah.
the attempt to sort of resurrect um, this sort of carnal desire for brutality and torture.
Well, and purity. We were better back
Sure.
then. And purity,
Yeah,
which, by the way, was a Roman
and
thing too, because every
purity of
emperor that came
violence.
along was saying, we want to restore the purity that our forefathers in the Roman Empire had. Get away from all this decadence and get back to something pure and true and Roman. So the weird thing is, the Romans did this to themselves. And then, of course, we use Rome as the example. And then we want to always get back to this mythical past.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very fascinating. It's interesting today how prominent discourse is about the Roman Empire.
Sure.
People can't get enough of talking about the Roman
Yeah,
social
one hears
order,
that. Hey, I want
and
to just jump into something else in the book that I found fascinating and open another door here. You talk in the book about the Jews are people that this has a lot to do with. We talk about the Holocaust and the rest, but I just want to read a passage. The Trump campaign showed the Republicans' ability to adapt and draw in the extremes from paleo-conservatives to radical rightists and open neo-fascists. When armed groups appear at mosques in the United States to decry Muslims and refugees, they are only presenting a radical material version of the ideology mouthed by leaders like Donald Trump with his thinly veiled calls to kill Muslims using bullets dipped in pig's blood, which is something he said once, and other such horrifying hate speech, when similar groups clad in black and aping leftist styles, again, scream go home at migrants in Europe or commandeer environmental protests for nationalist causes, they are only providing a less polite expression of the talking points crafted by the Nouvelle Droite, which means the new right in France, and fascist political demagogues like Christian Boucher and Alain Soral, who enter and leave radical right parties at will Indeed, following the election of Trump, and again, this was his first election, traditional groups that like to maintain a viable distance from fascism, like the League of the South, that's in Europe, unraveled
No,
their, yeah,
they're neo-Confederates, League of the
yeah,
South.
that's right, neo-Confederate. I'm getting mixed up with their French examples here. Unraveled their vague, uh, unraveled their vague disguise. Quote, once the globalist progressive coalition of Jews, minorities, and anti-white whites stops reeling in confusion from the results of yesterday's election, we can expect them to start striking back with trickery and violence. Again, ripped from the headlines. This was about the last time Trump was elected. And then everything, all of this comes out of the woodwork. I kind of have a vision of a kind of a burbling substrata to American culture, sort of the mud at the bottom of the pond. But usually it stays at the bottom of the pond. And once in a while, something bubbles up. But then this Trump cycle has somehow stirred the pond up, and now the whole thing is muddy. And the normalization of that kind of comment, reading that in your book
Yeah.
doesn't sound radical anymore because we're hearing it every day, even in some of the tweets that Musk and company are saying, "Oh yeah, that's right. They said it right." I mean,
Mhm.
so much of the unthinkable is happening now that it's as if what sounds extreme in your book and in the context of your book, written just before the first Trump presidency, is now so much part of the normal discourse. And that's before you even get into the kind of fictional areas of the internet and what's online with all the false information and so forth. So
Mm.
I want you to talk about that Jewish connection there for a while and the anti-Semitism that's in the whole thing. Um, while at the same time, the right is in America is sort of pro-Israel, quote unquote, in another way. That's another one of these strange anomalies. And then this kind of idea of the mud coming up in the pond and the normalizing of the history of fascism you've written into, basically what's happening is that your book is a history, but now it's become current events.
Yeah, I think the thing about anti-Semitism on the right is that there tends to be different currents, right? So there's a belligerently anti-Semitic current of the right wing, which was really embodied by Hitler's Nazi Party, right?
Yeah,
Um, and then there is a kind of pro-Israel part of the right wing, which sort of has its roots in evangelical Puritanism and goes
yeah,
back to Cromwell. If you
sure.
Cromwell and some of his supporters believed that England would bring the Jews back to the New Jerusalem, which they thought was England actually.
Yeah,
Anyway. So you get all these kinds of interesting turns and distortions with the British Israelites and things like that, which goes in awful anti-Semitic directions. And then you also get a kind of strange secular uh, sacralization of politics in Mussolini's fascist party, where Mussolini positioned himself in some ways as a protector of Jews before the race laws and before
yeah,
he became basically leashed up by Hitler. Before Hitler got into power, Mussolini was sort of a different ruler. He was extremely brutal and terrible for working people in Italy, but he also didn't round up all the Jews and send them to concentration camps.
right.
He sort of positioned himself in between the people in the fascist party like Prezzolini, who were vehement anti-Semites, and Giulio Avila, people like that, on the
Mm,
one hand. And then on the other hand, Jews who were in the fascist party of Italy, right?
yeah,
So, he tried to play this double game, but the power of Nazi Germany basically forced fascist Italy into rounding up the Jews of Rome and sending them to concentration camps.
yeah,
Um, so so there's a complicated history, and I think with Trump, he sort of is attempting also to play both sides. Musk seems more eager to promote open anti-Semites.
Yeah,
Trump doesn't do that quite as much.
yeah.
With Trump, you get a kind of a older type of sort of weird Jewish stereotyping where
Mm.
he's like, speaking to a group of Jews and he's like, "You guys, you're great merchants, you know."
Yeah, yeah. The
That's what
old
you do.
canard. Yeah,
Right. And so he has his like stereotypes and his ri kind of rigid way of thinking about things. But he's not quite as eager, it seems, to castigate Jewish people, um, to promote the castigation of Jewish people and to give it space to grow and fester.
yeah,
That said, the Trump coalition, because it has always included vicious anti-Semites like the America First youth movement that splintered away from the alt-right circa 2017,
mm,
led by Nick Fuentes. Those guys are real raging anti-Semites, and they've had a home for a long time in Trump's coalition, right? So regardless of where his ambivalent position actually lands,
yeah,
he's always kind of had through his movement a capacity to give anti-Semitism space to grow, right?
hmm,
And so that's why that's so complicated. And it's a similar case with the sort of with the Christian ultra-Zionists who are like going out to Israel to like join settler militias and things like that in the
yeah,
West Bank. I mean, that's not just like I believe that Israel has the right to exist. That's more like I want to be on the forefront of the most right-wing political movement in Israel today, you know?
yeah, yeah,
So uh, that in itself, shows the sort of the way that the right wing functions in the on the level of transnational collaboration, you
yeah.
know?
And then at the same time, Elon Musk retweets Holocaust deniers.
That's what I mean. Exactly. He's sort of gung ho about the whole thing on
Yeah, he is.
Twitter.
And but then, footnote to the John Hagees and these other ultra Zionist Christians is, of course, from their point of view, theologically speaking, this all has to do with the return of Christ and the apocalypse, and
Exactly.
Israel has to retake the West Bank, and then, all Jews will be killed except
Yeah.
144,000 that turn to
Yeah.
Christ. But other than that, we're on your side.
That's the other piece of that. Thank you very much for introducing that because that's the other part of it. It's like we want to fight for Israel. It's like why? It's like because all the Jews will be converted, and it's like oh okay,
Yeah.
Like,
Getting back to
that's not
Mussolini,
good.
Mussolini started rounding up Jews and putting them in Fossili, the concentration camp, after Hitler. The Germans moved into to Italy, and actually, one fascist that continued to protect Jews was Franco of Spain all the way through. There were no race laws there. Franco never, and I think both of those. There's where you get a little bit of the salutary influence of the strength of the Roman Catholic Church. This was a line that they they blinked at in Germany, but the Italians were loath to cross it as a people. So good luck rounding up Jews in an Italian village. These were your neighbors, and it didn't work quite that way. And in Spain, Franco actually never became part of that program.
So Franco's a fascinating character, right? I mean, he had the anti-belligerence pact with the Nazis that was sort of the prototype that Stalin later used.
Yeah.
And Spain has a pretty profound tradition of expelling and torturing and murdering Jews,
Oh yeah.
which
Well,
which
so did everybody else in Europe at one point or another.
yeah, and the Spanish Inquisition was also directed at Muslims too, because it was part of the reconquest of
Yeah.
Spain. And I think that the thing about Franco that made him a uniquely bloody dictator in his own right
Yeah,
was the fact that there was a civil war, which he started, more or
correct.
less. And there's disputes, but he was the one who invaded Republican Spain.
Yeah,
Um, and as a result of that civil war, Franco slaughtered more of his specifically political opponents
yeah,
than Mussolini.
yeah,
So that is kind of the interesting thing about the Franquista repression, right? Is that
yeah.
it was tens and 100,000 people who were killed through the Civil War and the resulting
Yeah, and by
repression.
the way, one of the things that came out of that repression was his affiliation with the extreme right in the Roman Catholic Church in Spain, which formalized itself in the Opus Dei movement, which now
Mm.
transplants into the United States in the Heritage Foundation and the people who are running it.
Yeah,
And Leo, who is over, helping make lists of Supreme Court justices. So it's not that far away from where we are right here.
well, the Opus Dei is a very fascinating faction as well, right? Because they also collaborated in the transition to democracy from Franquista dictatorship. So they're
Yeah,
kind of like an interesting body
yeah,
in their own way. Um, and I think like the other thing about Franco to point out is his economic policy of autarky. Again, very kind of similar to Trump's position in the sense that Franco believed that Spain had to return to its sort of primal roots, economically speaking, and
yeah,
he's actually focused on agriculture and diverting water to his supporters in order to reward them, even though they
yeah,
lived in arid environments.
yeah,
And his autarky policies actually failed miserably,
yeah,
which is a big part of why Spain ended up transitioning out of democracy, because there was an economic movement before there was a political movement, and that economic movement was also combined with the normalization of Franco's regime through Spain's membership in NATO.
yeah,
So basically, Franco's economy, his economic policies, failed.
yeah,
NATO said sort of, we'll let you in if, you start to reform your economic platform.
yeah,
And by the 1970s, Spain had no semblance in economic terms to what it was in the 1950s.
yeah,
And it was that sort of economic liberalization that laid out the sort of the red carpet for a transition to democracy, which was so sorely needed.
yeah. Hey, I have a question for you. I'm going to go to some of the conclusions you draw in your book, and we'll talk about those that begin, although it has some roots in totalitarian political ideals that emerged from the Enlightenment. Fascism, and particularly the neo-reaction, relies more strongly on the anti-Enlightenment tradition. More specifically, it depends on the instrumental failures and hypocrisies in the practices of the Enlightenment ideas of liberty and equality. That the
Mm.
US Constitution affirmed freedom and equality while hypocritically maintaining genocidal war and slavery against Native and African people only exposes even more the contradictions between Enlightenment notions of equality and the forms of political domination that would ultimately contribute to the development of fascism. I find that a very interesting passage in two ways. First on the face of it, but again, it's one of these things where you could be talking about the critique of the Enlightenment now leveled by left-wing woke students on our college campuses who also don't like the Enlightenment because for them anything that's not pure and totally unhypocritical is not valid. And of course, as an old 72-year-old guy who's been around the block a few times, my view of that is, well, good luck storming the castle, because if purity's your thing, you're going to have trouble getting anything done. And in that light, I want to ask you whether that kind of unintended subtext there is something you thought about, or am I just making shit up?
No, I mean I'm a proud pinko. I'm like I'm left wing,
Yes. Yeah.
I think there are definitely people on the left who don't like me and who think, oh no, I'm just a reactionary or something like that. And
Yeah.
that always happens. And so like I mean, I don't like walk around saying like I'm Mr. Woke, I'm woke do to do, but I
Yeah.
also like, I feel like that term is typically sort of it's thrown around a little incautiously, or rather that it's used to describe the tendencies of marginal groups and
Yeah.
experiences, and take it pars pro toto to characterize an entire group,
Yeah.
which is exactly what the alt-right used to do and what brought them so much attention. Um, and Breitbart was their platform, right?
Yes,
Because
exactly.
what they would do is they would say, "Oh, look at this lady who's walking around her campus with a mattress on her back because she says she was sexually assaulted and nobody did anything about it. Like,
Yeah.
what a weirdo. Look at this person who, walks around with like cat makeup on her face or something,
Sure. They
just
take the
like
margins and the
this
extremes.
ludicrous thing. Oh, isn't that just what you see every day? No,
Yeah.
because I live in the suburbs and I'm not really exposed to those populations, but sure, I'll take your word for it. Those people are idiots,
Must be
Ha
happening
ha
all the
ha.
time. Must
Let's
happen
go
all the
beat the
time.
crap out of them. That
Yeah.
was how it was in 2016. And so, yeah, I just find like that's why I wrote it. Long
Yeah.
story short, because of what you just said, yes, I have a lot of experience arguing with people on the left about the Enlightenment and saying, no, I actually, I think that those are good principles, that we should actually have principles, and I am a universalist. I think what goes up comes down. There are
Yeah.
laws in this world that govern our behavior to a degree, that govern the natural world. And they can be bent, but you can't really break them.
Yeah.
Airplanes fly. We have Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Vaccines work. There
Yeah.
are like certain things that you can't just say, oh, it's just triumph of the will all around. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, those are just sort of my principles. And I think like freedom and equality are intelligent principles that we ought to recognize, and we
Yeah.
ought to sort of hone our mental models, our models of the ways that we act and
Yeah.
understand and interpret things, on the basis of the fact that society works better when we acknowledge that we're all part of it and that humanity is a social animal, if you will. And I'll get really like stupid and Aristotelian with you. But the point is, we live in a democracy for a reason. Democracy succeeds for a reason,
Yeah.
and we ought to maintain those principles that are at its basis. But unfortunately, it's always an imperfect operation,
Yeah.
And yes, there's hypocrisy, and I have to mention that because it's true. And if we don't mention it, and if we don't return to the hard facts and realities of history, we won't be able to get any better, you
Yeah.
know? And it's the Republicans who want to say, no, everything was just great. There's no hypocrisy. Thomas Jefferson was pure, right?
Yeah.
And it's the left who says, no, Thomas Jefferson was an evil maniac, And it's like, well, maybe things are kind of complicated, and we ought to recognize, aspirations and ideals and practical applications and people who were really compromised.
Hmm.
Thomas Jefferson famously saying, with regards to slavery, Thomas Jefferson, a slave owner, saying that, we had the wolf by the ears and we couldn't let it go or it's going to eat us. You know what I
Yeah.
mean?
Yeah. He
Like,
saw it coming, and so did
and
Adams, and Abigail
Henry
Adams wrote him
Clay.
letters about it.
Yeah, Henry Clay,
Yeah.
Adams. I mean, all these guys, they didn't like slavery, but and yet they were slave owners. It's
Yeah.
like, why? Oh, well, it's England's fault. Well, there were problems, right?
Yeah.
Nobody did anything about it, and look what happened. So we have to acknowledge like our problems. We have to
Hmm.
make them better, or else we're gonna end up in a lot of trouble. And so, with going back to anti-Semitism, because I have a tendency, defensively, I'll admit, to say, well, on the right wing, this is da 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 da.
Sure.
But on the left wing, we have anti-Semitism as well. And it's just like misogyny, right? We can't, again, stand back with our hands crossed and say, look at what the right is doing. This
Sure.
is just how they are. They say that about the left when it comes to anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
And you know what? Sometimes both of them are right.
Yeah.
We've got major problems with anti-Semitism in the West. I know a lot of places all over the world have anti-Semitism problems, but if we don't actually address it, then we're just as hypocritical as people
Yeah.
we accuse, right?
Yeah.
So,
Hey, I want to just make sure everybody understands that, again, this is Alexander Reid Ross, and he is an author. And we're going to feature his book in January in our book club. It has to be read. And the book is Against the Fascist Creep. And again, in the last couple of books and authors that we've been talking about here are sadly apropos of the moment. It's just amazing you wrote this book a few years ago, and it's probably only now that it's fully realized in the sense that your book is not just prophetic, but who wants to read about the history of fascism, what it really is, and how it came about? Well, if you want to understand the American moment right now, maybe you do. So I would urge people to order this book. You talk toward the end of your book, and you say that I'm just trying to read something here. Humanity's struggle with the dilemma of contemporary nihilism, the dilemma of no dilemma in a way, is long-standing and will not be overcome by political or spiritual promises of a solution. Pessimism in the era of climate change can only destroy the formulation of clear strategies for the survival of humanity. Ideas only exist insofar as they can be set into practice. Authoritarianism and its effective cycles of violence and revenge against those deemed unequal or weak can only be halted through the ethic of cooperation and mutual aid. Hope, you write, is the only way forward. And I think you wrote those lines before Trump's reelection. And wow, did they leap off the page as I read them now? Talk a little bit about hope being the only way forward and how you would argue for that, which of course I love the idea. Um, I'm wondering how you see that in the light of something that I've done some reading about, which is that human evolution really depended in terms of our society and structures less on the survival of the fittest idea than the survival of the friendliest, as in cooperation is it. That's the only reason anybody ever survives or any culture
mhm.
survives. And that seemed to
Yeah.
tie in with the ending of your book. So I just throw that out there.
Yeah, that's I still believe that. And it's not like a coping mechanism, right?
Yeah.
That's not because I think like, well, if that isn't true, then what else is there to live for? That's not really the point. We have our lives to live, right?
Yeah.
We have to sort of understand poetry and creativity and the way that life functions and our own belonging. A lot of the crisis of people in the existential sort of sense is that longing for place.
Yeah.
People really want to feel like they fit in. They want to feel like they have a place, and they want to feel proud to a
Yeah.
degree. Um, they don't want to be like ashamed of their place in the world. And I feel like, we have to send uplifting messages when we have to live our lives in uplifting ways. This
Mm.
is, in my opinion, like a real sort of the demand that integrity places on us. Van Gogh used to talk a lot about duty. He's
Yeah.
an interesting example. I guess it just jumped into my head, but work and duty and the idea that like we're all in it together and you've gotta follow your heart. You gotta do the things that you need to do and that you love to do.
Yeah.
Um and and keep your head up, right? So that's sort of like the way that I confront these challenges that we face. A lot of it comes through my experience as an opponent of the Second Iraq War when I was like 18 years old and just feeling constantly driven down by the news and just so like broken by everything,
Yeah.
and climbing out of that, the only way I was really kind of able to confront and defeat just the daunting emotional weight of the whole, in my opinion, moral collapse of that time was to become like a fighter for truth and
Mm.
integrity, you know? And that's sort of just, I mean, it sounds lame in the sense that it sounds dumb in the sense that it sounds almost like some like dumb like middle-aged chivalric type of
Yeah.
thing,
Yeah.
like fighter for honesty or something like that. But I don't know, it works.
Yeah.
It works. So the other part of that is I'm not about to say it's not problematic to
Mm.
become energized by the purity of the ideal and to think yourself the beholder of universal truth in the world, right? But
Yeah.
I'm a scientist. I try to like be dispassionate about facts in the world. I try to take methodical
Mm.
steps to study and understand things. And I try to stay, ambivalent about things that I don't understand with a high degree of confidence through a confluence of evidence, right?
Yeah.
So, and that said, also, as you noted, the title of that conclusion is Swords into Plowshares. I'm
Yeah.
against war and I'm against violence. That doesn't mean that I don't think that it's ever worked in the sense of defending people's rights.
Sure.
But in the sense that it's not my motivation,
Yeah. No, no, I
and
understand.
it's not something that I like. I,
Yeah.
I think we need to struggle for integrity of ourselves and of our society. And in my opinion, like one of the number one ways of doing that is just trying to stop so much disinformation.
Yeah.
I really feel like we need to have a reckoning with information as entertainment, with the allure of creating media for its own sake and for our own celebrity rather than for the sake of understanding the world,
Yeah.
you know? And I think we just generally need better aesthetics.
Yeah. So last question in that that my producer Ernie Gregg just sent me, which apropos of what you were just saying, he's saying, what is the role of the media in an age of information overload, but also misinformation and false information? How do you see that?
The rule is that it's totally changed the entire American party system.
Yeah.
I mean, if you look at like what a party system is, something of in the United States, a tendency to develop Manichaean political apparatuses
Yeah.
based on specific oppositional dynamics within society, along geographic lines, cultural lines, political, socioeconomic, and media plays, and it always has played
Yeah.
maybe the cardinal role in the American party system.
Yeah.
Very from Van Buren, right? From the formation of the Jacksonian phenomenon,
Yeah.
media has driven the party system.
Well, now how do you see that? Because the media is us. We're the media now. I mean, Joe Rogan has more people listening to him at any one moment than MSNBC and Fox News combined.
Yeah, yeah, I know. No, I know. And I think that this is something that has hoisted Trump to power, and
Yeah,
it's something that the Democrats are still trying to catch up to.
to figure it out.
Yeah, and the sooner that the Democratic Party does it, the better, because they have been kind of lagging behind in this whole
Yeah,
tendency, partly because the way the kind of entrepreneurial frontiersman kind of way that social media has been staked out and
yeah.
explored has been devastating
Well,
to
and unlike the
people's.
conventional media, there is no legal guardrails because they're not responsible for anything they publish. They just say,
Exactly.
oh, somebody else put it online. We're not responsible for this beheading that just got stuck on, Facebook.
Exactly. And when you look at the history of the American party system, you see like people who tend to try to scale back the constant propulsion of the grassroots,
Yeah,
in the United States are the ones who typically get crushed under the wheel. You
yeah,
look at the Federalists, the Whigs, the National Democrats. I mean,
sure,
these are the ones who were like, we're not so sure about westward expansion. We have to calibrate, like we have to kind of
sure.
be careful. And, all those parties were
And they get
demolished.
rolled over.
They get
Oh,
rolled over. And so I
yeah,
think that the Democratic Party maybe needs to be a little less Whiggish
yeah.
and a little bit more sort of uh have a bit more of like a forward strategy in
Hmm.
understanding and developing a less
Well, maybe
formal.
that can be your next book. Are you working on that?
Actually, you got me. You got me.
Good. Yeah, I think you
I
should.
can't really talk about anything, but
Well, once it's done, get in touch with my producer, Ernie Gregg. Hey, do me a
all right.
favor. I'm going to sign off here in just a second. After I leave, please you stick around for a minute and talk with Ernie, our producer, because we're always looking for the names of people you think we should be interviewing. They don't have to be authors, just people you think have something to say maybe we don't know.
All right.
And then let me say one more time, this is In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer, and my guest today has been Alexander Reid Ross. And he has written a book that will be our has to be read offering in January. It is called Against the Fascist Creep. If you want to understand where we are, read the book. It's really well done and incredibly informative, but also a real history of fascism starting back in the 19th century and beyond, and then up to our own period of history. Please subscribe to In Conversation with Frank Schaeffer on Apple Podcasts and to my Substack, It Has to Be Said, which is my regular commentary avenue that we do. Please subscribe on Substack and on YouTube, drive our numbers a little bit and help us. And we will reread, repush, relaunch your book in January. And in the meantime, good luck with whatever else you're writing, because I certainly just think your book on fascism is phenomenal. It's just such a document.
Thanks so much, Frank. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, me too. This has been great. Stick around and talk to Ernie. Give us some good names.
All right.
Okay, bye.
All right. Bye.